There is a category of death that emergency physicians recognize immediately and that the general public almost never thinks about until it is happening to someone they love, and by that point it is frequently too late to reverse. It does not arrive with the drama of a structural collapse or the visible violence of a flood surge or the unmistakable signal of a fire consuming a building. It arrives quietly. It arrives in the dark, while people are sleeping, or while they are sitting in a room that feels normal and smells normal and offers no sensory warning of any kind that the air they are breathing has crossed a threshold from life-sustaining to lethal. It arrives in the form of a gas that has no color, no odor, no taste, and no immediately perceptible physical effect until the neurological damage it produces has already reached a level that prevents the victim from taking the single action that would save their life, which is to leave the space they are in. Carbon monoxide, the documented primary silent killer of disaster aftermath scenarios, the poison that activates not during the emergency itself, but in the hours and days following it, when people have survived the initial event and believe the worst is behind them, and have made decisions about heating, cooking, and power generation that introduce lethal concentrations of an invisible gas into the sealed, poorly ventilated spaces where they are sheltering. The decisions that kill them are not reckless decisions in the way that recklessness is normally understood. They are logical decisions made by people trying to stay warm, trying to feed their families, trying to maintain some functional capacity in a degraded environment, made without the specific technical knowledge that would have told them that the thing they were doing to survive was going to kill them within hours. The evidence for carbon monoxide as the dominant post-disaster silent killer is not ambiguous, and it is not recent. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has published extensive epidemiological data on carbon monoxide poisoning in disaster aftermath scenarios across multiple decades and multiple event types, and the pattern that emerges from that data is consistent, predictable, and therefore preventable in a way that the mortality numbers do not reflect. After Hurricane Katrina, carbon monoxide poisoning accounted for a significant portion of post-storm deaths that occurred after the storm itself had passed. After Hurricane Ivan, after the 2003 Northeast blackout, after Hurricane Sandy, after every major winter storm event that has caused widespread power outages across the continental United States in the past 30 years, the same pattern appears with near-perfect consistency. People survive the primary event. They lose power, they get cold, or they need to cook, or they need to run equipment that requires electrical power. They bring inside or operate in inadequately ventilated spaces devices that produce carbon monoxide as a combustion byproduct, and they die. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough of them, in numbers consistent enough across events separated by decades in geography, to constitute one of the most clear-cut, preventable mortality patterns in emergency medicine. The knowledge that would prevent these deaths is not complicated. It is not technically demanding. It requires understanding one molecule, one physiological mechanism, one set of behavioral rules, and one category of detection technology. That is the complete universe of information required to eliminate this cause of death from the post-disaster mortality equation. And yet the deaths continue, event after event, because that information has not been effectively transmitted to the population that needs it. Understanding why carbon monoxide is so uniquely lethal requires going into the biochemistry, and the biochemistry is both elegant and horrifying in equal measure. The human body's oxygen delivery system is built around a protein called hemoglobin, which is the iron-containing molecule in red blood cells responsible for binding oxygen in the lungs and transporting it through the bloodstream to every tissue in the body. Hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen is the product of billions of years of evolutionary optimization, and it is genuinely remarkable in its efficiency under normal conditions. But hemoglobin has a catastrophic vulnerability that evolution did not anticipate because the selective pressure to address it simply did not exist in the natural environments in which human physiology developed. Hemoglobin binds carbon monoxide with an affinity approximately 240 times greater than its affinity for oxygen. This is not a slight preference. This is an overwhelming, essentially irreversible competitive advantage that carbon monoxide holds over oxygen at every hemoglobin binding site it reaches. When carbon monoxide enters the bloodstream through the lungs, it displaces oxygen from hemoglobin binding sites and forms carboxyhemoglobin, a stable compound that does not release and does not participate in oxygen transport. The hemoglobin molecule that has bound carbon monoxide is, for the duration of that binding, effectively removed from the body's oxygen delivery system. It circulates, it passes through the heart, it reaches peripheral tissues, but it delivers nothing. It is a transport vehicle carrying poison instead of fuel, completing its circuit through the body without contributing to the metabolic processes that every cell depends on for survival. The insidious dimension of this biochemistry, the dimension that makes carbon monoxide so specifically lethal in ways that other toxic gases are not, is the relationship between carboxyhemoglobin concentration and symptom presentation. At low concentrations of carboxyhemoglobin, below approximately 10% of total hemoglobin, most healthy adults experience no symptoms, or symptoms so mild and nonspecific that they are indistinguishable from dozens of common minor ailments: slight headache, mild fatigue, very faint nausea. These are symptoms that virtually every person alive has experienced from stress, poor sleep, dehydration, or any number of entirely benign causes. And in a disaster aftermath scenario, where stress, poor sleep, and dehydration are the baseline condition, these symptoms register as the expected background discomfort of a difficult situation, rather than as a physiological alarm signal. As carboxyhemoglobin concentration rises toward 20 to 30%, symptoms intensify to throbbing headache, dizziness, confusion, and weakness, but the confusion itself begins to impair the cognitive function necessary to recognize that something is biochemically wrong and to take corrective action. This is the feedback loop that kills people. The gas that is poisoning you impairs the brain function you need to recognize that you are being poisoned, and it does so progressively, incrementally, in a gradient that gives the victim no clear threshold moment at which the danger becomes obvious. There is no sudden alarm state. There is a slow dimming of cognitive capacity that the victim experiences, if they experience it consciously at all, as unusual tiredness, as the heaviness of a difficult day, as the desire to lie down and rest, that is, in a disaster scenario, entirely contextually appropriate and entirely lethal. Above 30 to 40% carboxyhemoglobin saturation, the victim typically loses consciousness. At this point, without external intervention, death is a matter of time determined by the continued exposure concentration and the victim's baseline cardiovascular and respiratory health. A healthy adult at 40% carboxyhemoglobin saturation who continues to breathe air with elevated carbon monoxide concentration will progress to fatal levels without regaining consciousness. The body continues to breathe, the heart continues to beat, but the oxygen delivery system has been so thoroughly compromised that the metabolic demands of vital organs, beginning with the heart muscle in the brain, cannot be met, and organ failure proceeds in a sequence that ends in cardiac arrest. The victim dies, in most cases, appearing simply to be asleep, which is why carbon monoxide deaths are so frequently discovered many hours after the fact, and why the initial assessment is so often natural causes, until the investigation reveals the combustion source and the environmental conditions that produced the poisoning. The specific disaster scenario that most reliably creates carbon monoxide poisoning conditions is power outage combined with cold ambient temperature, and the frequency with which this combination occurs in the United States and globally means that the threat is not exotic or improbable. It is a routine consequence of winter storms, ice storms, extended grid failures, and the fuel supply disruptions that accompany major natural disasters. When power fails in cold weather, the immediate and entirely rational human response is to find alternative heat sources, and it is in the selection and use of those alternative heat sources that the lethal decisions are made. Portable gasoline-powered generators brought indoors or operated in attached garages with doors closed. Propane or natural gas camp stoves operated in sealed indoor spaces for cooking and supplemental heat. Charcoal grills brought inside, a practice that is so reliably lethal that it has its own extensive subsection in the CDC's carbon monoxide poisoning literature. Kerosene heaters operated in rooms without adequate ventilation. Vehicle engines run in attached garages to provide heat or to charge devices. Each of these practices introduces carbon monoxide into an enclosed space at rates that, depending on the device, the space volume, and the ventilation conditions, can produce lethal concentrations within minutes to hours. The generation rates of carbon monoxide from common portable equipment are data points that almost nobody in the civilian population knows, and that would, if widely understood, change behavior dramatically. A typical portable gasoline generator operating at full load produces carbon monoxide at a rate sufficient to raise the concentration in a standard two-car garage from 0 to the immediately dangerous to life and health threshold of 1,200 parts per million in less than 5 minutes with the garage door closed. Less than 5 minutes. A charcoal grill burning a standard load of charcoal produces carbon monoxide at rates that can raise a small room from 0 to lethal concentration in under an hour. A propane camp stove operating in a sealed room of average size produces carbon monoxide as a combustion byproduct at rates that vary with combustion efficiency, but that can exceed safe thresholds within a few hours of continuous operation, particularly as oxygen concentration in the room drops and combustion efficiency decreases, which paradoxically increases carbon monoxide production relative to carbon dioxide production. These are not theoretical worst-case calculations. These are measured values from controlled studies conducted by the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the CDC, and independent research institutions. And they represent the actual rate at which the environments people create in disaster scenarios transition from survivable to lethal. The ventilation question is where the engineering intersects with the behavioral reality of disaster scenarios in a way that creates maximum danger. In warm weather, with windows open and natural ventilation occurring, many of these combustion sources can be operated more safely because the carbon monoxide produced is diluted and dispersed before it reaches dangerous concentrations. But disaster scenarios that drive the use of alternative heat and power sources are disproportionately cold weather events, and cold weather human behavior involves closing every opening in a structure to preserve heat. The same instinct that makes thermal sense, seal the building envelope to retain warmth, eliminates the ventilation that would prevent carbon monoxide accumulation. People are simultaneously maximizing their combustion heat output and minimizing the ventilation that would make that combustion survivable, and they are doing so with the best possible intentions and the worst possible outcome. The structure that feels warmest, most secure, and best sealed against the cold is the structure that is most rapidly accumulating a lethal atmospheric concentration of an invisible, odorless gas. The comfort of warmth and the approach of death are, under these conditions, the same sensation. The detection technology that makes this entire threat category manageable is carbon monoxide detection, and the gap between the availability of this technology and its actual deployment in disaster preparedness contexts represents one of the most straightforward and most consequential failures in civilian preparedness culture. A battery-operated carbon monoxide detector costs between $20 and $40 at any hardware or home goods retailer. It requires no installation expertise. It operates for years on standard batteries. It detects carbon monoxide at concentrations well below the threshold of physiological effect and produces an audible alarm that can wake a sleeping occupant with sufficient time to evacuate before neurological impairment becomes incapacitating. The technology works. It is reliable. It is inexpensive. It is accessible to virtually every household in the developed world. And in the disaster aftermath scenarios where it is most critically needed, it is absent from
the vast majority of affected households, either because the household never purchased one, because the household purchased one that is hardwired and therefore non-functional during a power outage, or because the battery in the existing detector was depleted and never replaced. The deaths that follow are not deaths caused by a lack of technology. They are deaths caused by a lack of knowledge about the threat that the technology addresses, and a consequent failure to prioritize acquiring and maintaining that technology before the emergency arrives. The preparedness framework for carbon monoxide as a post-disaster threat has 3 components, and all 3 must be in place before the emergency occurs, because the emergency environment does not permit the deliberate, calm acquisition and installation of safety equipment. The first component is detection, which means battery-operated carbon monoxide detectors, plural, positioned at sleeping level in every area of the structure where occupants will sleep or spend extended time, with fresh batteries installed at the beginning of every preparedness review cycle. The second component is behavioral protocol, which means a pre-established and rehearsed set of rules governing the use of combustion equipment in or near the structure, rules that are specific enough to be executable under stress and that do not rely on real-time judgment about ventilation adequacy, because real-time judgment about ventilation adequacy is not a reliable safety mechanism in a disaster scenario. The third component is equipment selection, which means evaluating alternative heat and power sources before the emergency, with carbon monoxide generation as an explicit selection criterion rather than an afterthought. These 3 components together constitute a complete carbon monoxide defense, and any one of them alone is insufficient.
But carbon monoxide, as catastrophic as it is not the only silent killer that the disaster aftermath environment activates in the unprepared household. It is the most acute, the most immediately lethal, and the one with the clearest single-point intervention. The broader category of silent killers in the post-disaster domestic environment includes threats that operate on longer timescales, that are less immediately dramatic in their symptom presentation, and that are therefore even more consistently overlooked in preparedness planning. The second major category is water contamination, and the way in which water contamination operates as a silent killer in disaster scenarios is substantially more complex than the simple recognition that floodwater is dirty. The complexity lies in the failure modes of water treatment and distribution infrastructure, the biological and chemical agents that those failures introduce into water supplies, the inadequacy of most civilian water treatment methods for the specific contaminant profiles that disaster scenarios produce, and the delayed symptom onset of waterborne illness that prevents victims from connecting their illness to the contaminated water source until well after continued consumption has increased their pathogen load to clinically significant levels. Municipal water treatment systems are engineering marvels under normal operating conditions, delivering water that meets rigorous microbiological and chemical safety standards to millions of consumers simultaneously through a continuous process of source water treatment, disinfection, and distribution system maintenance. But these systems have specific and well-documented vulnerability points that disaster scenarios exploit with systematic reliability. The treatment process depends on continuous power for pumping, continuous chemical feed for disinfection, and continuous operator oversight for process control. Power outages interrupt pumping, which drops distribution system pressure. Dropped distribution system pressure allows the intrusion of groundwater, soil water, and the biological and chemical contaminants those waters carry into the distribution pipes through cracks, joints, and service connections that are normally protected by the positive pressure differential between the pipe interior and the surrounding environment.
This intrusion process, called backflow or backsiphonage, depending on the specific mechanism, can introduce microbial contamination into distribution system water that has already been treated, and that, to the consumer drawing it from a tap, appears entirely normal. It is clear, it has no unusual odor, it has no unusual taste, and it may contain pathogen concentrations sufficient to cause serious illness in healthy adults and life-threatening illness in the elderly, the immunocompromised, and young children.
The specific pathogens that disaster-related water contamination events most commonly introduce into distribution systems and private wells represent a spectrum of biological threat that most preparedness resources address only superficially. Enteric bacteria, primarily coliform species, including Escherichia coli and the Salmonella and Shigella genera, are the most commonly discussed contaminants, and the ones that standard water treatment methods address most effectively. But the pathogen profile of disaster-related water contamination is not limited to enteric bacteria, and the broader profile includes organisms that are substantially more resistant to standard disinfection methods and substantially more dangerous to human health. Cryptosporidium parvum, a protozoan parasite that forms environmentally resistant oocysts capable of surviving standard chlorination at concentrations used in municipal treatment, is a particularly significant threat in flood-related contamination events because it is abundant in agricultural runoff and animal waste, both of which are mobilized in large quantities by flooding and introduced into water sources that may feed distribution systems or private wells. The 1993 Milwaukee Cryptosporidium outbreak, which sickened over 400,000 people through a municipal water system that was operating within its normal treatment parameters, is the most dramatic demonstration of this vulnerability in the United States public health record. But it is not an isolated event. Cryptosporidium outbreaks associated with contaminated water supplies have been documented in disaster aftermath contexts repeatedly, and the outcome in each case was large-scale gastrointestinal illness in a population that was already physiologically stressed by the disaster conditions and that had limited access to the medical care and oral rehydration resources needed to manage the illness safely.